Unnatural Persecution by a Vampire of Mr. Jacob J. by Thomas Ligotti. A young school teacher who writes a little poetry on the side is coming home to the boarding house where he lives on the top floor. A red-haired girl, one of his pupils, runs up to him just as he steps onto the old boarding house stairway. "Have you heard about the vampire, Mr. Jacob?" she asks him, squinting in the bright afternoon sunlight. The girl goes on to describe the vampire and its activities, as they in turn have been related to her, principally from eyewitness accounts. "Of course, I know all that," replies Mr. Jacob. "Well, see you tomorrow," he says, crushing a cigarette underfoot. He doesn't like his students to see him smoking if he can help it. That night, Mr. Jacob can't sleep. He knows this business with the vampire is just nonsense, but in the middle of the night, certain things can get on your nerves that normally you wouldn't think twice about. He drags himself out of bed and opens the only window in his room. How quiet everything is at this hour. Somehow, it seems as if he has just noticed this for the first time. The next day, the reports about the vampire are verified by several honest and reliable persons. The body of a man from out of town was found that morning in his hotel room, drained of blood. Mr. Jacob, along with many others, concurs that he felt something strange was up the last few days. Something he couldn't exactly put his finger on. Tonight, Mr. Jacob is taking no chances. He sits by the sole window in his room, hour after hour, with a large crucifix across his lap. Every little while, he forgets himself and dozes off. But each time, he manages to startle his mind back to alertness with just one thought about the vampire. As the days go by, the situation worsens. Many more bodies are found, drained of blood. Mr. Jacob hasn't had a decent rest since this terrible season of death began. All night long, he sits, gazing deep into the darkness beyond that idiotic little window. And he's smoking, too. One day, he coughs up some blood into his hand, right in the middle of a grammar lesson. Due to the inherent limits of the human will, Mr. Jacob falls sound asleep one night by the window. Maybe he is only dreaming when he hears these little taps on the glass, but he wakes up just the same. "No," he screams, leaping from the chair and knocking the crucifix to the floor. He is shivering violently, as if some icy wind has rushed into the room and is tearing its way straight through him. But there is no wind. Outside the window, all is quiet and dead. The next day, there is good news. The vampire has moved on. Everyone is safe once more. Mr. Jacob opens his window for the first time in weeks on a radiant morning in early spring. Children are singing for joy in the street. He suddenly closes the window and turns back toward his little room. for Mr. Jacob knows that everyone is suffering from a false sense of security. He stays on his guard. Night after night, he waits by the window, thinking one day the vampire will return. But for some reason, she never does. Late that summer, nobody in town is surprised to hear that one evening Mr. Jacob lost his balance and fell into the street below. He'd started drinking heavily, poor man. An unfortunate mishap. And just as autumn semester was to begin,